Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Saltwater Scoundrels, Pirates, and Privateers on the High Seas with our guest speaker, Dr. Rebecca Sinon. So, North Carolina's coast has long been linked with dramatic tales of piracy. During the golden age of piracy, its shallow sounds and hidden inlets offered perfect shelter for outlaws like Blackbeard, who made his final stand near Ocracoke Island. These remote waterways created a rugged environment where danger and opportunity often went hand in hand. This same sort of untamed landscape appears in Outlander, where Claire and Jamie navigate colonial North Carolina amid rising tensions and shifting loyalties. Although the pirates lived a generation earlier, Stede Bonnet is technically probably a privateer and not a pirate, but our guest will talk about that. Both their stories in Outlander share the same spirit of adventure rooted in North Carolina's wild and storied past. So while the golden age of piracy was over by the time the Frasers hit the North Carolina shore, pirates are part of the rich history of North Carolina. And so this program is about the general history of pirates in the Carolinas with some Outlander thrown in. Even though piracy is really not a main storyline in Outlander, there's enough of it, I think, to justify talking about it in terms of North Carolina history. So tonight, first, we do this housekeeping thing. Program is 1 hour, and we will hopefully have time for questions. We have had mostly time to do for our questions. So I think she said her presentation is about 45 minutes, so we should be good. Closed captions are available from Zoom, so is the transcript. You can see that on the bottom of your Zoom toolbar and toggle that on and off as you wish. We are recording, and you'll get a link in the post-program email telling you where the recording will be. The program is the next to the last in our Outlander Highland to Carolina program series, and we have a lot of resources for you. Visit our webpage to learn everything. You can also sign up for the What Last program in case you've not done it. And any information gathered tonight will be put on the website, and it will also go out to you in the post-program email. So lastly, please use the chat feature to post questions or chat with us or each other. If you asked a question in the registration form, there's no need for you to ask it again because we've got you. Take a second to set your chat audience to everyone so that if you ask a question, everyone can see the answer so it makes sense. If you don't want to be distracted by chat, you can turn off the chat previews by toggling the chat icon on the bottom of the screen on the Zoom toolbar. We know that not everyone wants to chat, and that is okay. So even Stede Bonnet wants you to know how to turn off the chat previews if you wish. And he looks pretty fierce, so we probably should, pay attention to him. So our final program in the series is an evening with Outlander author Diana Gabaldon. That is going to be on Thursday, December 4th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And we know the TV show is going to be ending in the spring. We're going to be sad and suffering. So we are going to be hosting Alex Dold. She is the doctor of Outlander. She has a doctorate in historical fiction and public history through the lens of Outlander. So that will be probably in May, and there will be more information coming on that. So all of our other virtual programs, you are welcome to attend. In the beginning of 2026, we have things like getting organized, how to winter, what can you do with a rotisserie chicken, the history of cookbooks, and we're going to have a small true crime series. So you can sign up for our monthly newsletter of virtual programs. Erin will put that link in the chat, and you'll get it in, you guessed it, the post-program email. So happy Thanksgiving, Sassenachs, and our gift to you is more work. No, not really. If you have an Outlander fan at your Thanksgiving dinner table, you can make these mini books that can be used as a napkin ring or a wine glass charm. You can download the materials you need at the program series website. But if you're crazy busy and no time to do anything like us, you can always print out Outlander bookmarks. It's our holiday gift to you. From us, from me and Erin. So you've seen this slide 7 times now, but it's different this time because it has a pirate background. So kindly let us know how we are doing. We will put a link in to the survey in the post-program email that will go out in a day or two. Finally, I get to introduce Dr. Rebecca Sinon. She is a world expert on the history of piracy, public executions, crime, and law in the early modern Caribbean, Great Britain, and colonial America. She earned her PhD from King's College in London, and her dissertation examined British maritime and legal supremacy in the early American colonies in regards to maritime piracy. She used the public executions of pirates in London and the Americas to see how the colonists reacted to increased legal restrictions by British authorities, which ultimately led to new ideas of autonomy. Dr. Sinon is the author of 3 books. The first book, Why We Love Pirates, The Hunt for Captain Kidd and How He Changed Piracy, which came out in 2020, discusses transformation of real pirates during the golden age of piracy from their authentic history into pop culture phenomena. The book has been called an excellent guide to how pirates became the outlaw celebrities of the high seas. We do own that book, the library does, so people that have Wake County Public Library cards, you can read it and request it and read it. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Sinon. Turn it over to her when she gets on. There you go. You want to, you're muted.
Oops. Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
We're excited to have you here.
All right. Should I just go ahead and get started, I guess?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. All right, so thank you. So thanks again to the Wake County Public Library. I am very excited to be here to talk about saltwater scoundrels, pirates, privateers on the high seas. So the way I'm going to kind of structure this is I'll be talking about the general history of pirates, just to give us kind of this background information, and then looking at the Carolina connection to Scotland and the maritime world, and of course piracy. We're going to look at some of the infamous pirates known to North Carolina, which I know many in the audience knows all about. And then in terms of Outlander, we'll look a little bit at the kind of the maritime world within Outlander. And of course, we're going to be looking at Stede Bonnet as kind of our case study in terms of piracy within the Outlander series. All right. So in order to kind of understand piracy during the 18th century, we have to go backwards a little bit. So kind of we're looking at what's called the Golden Age of piracy. And the Golden Age of piracy was a time period within the Americas with what we call the Atlantic world, which basically encompasses everything bordering the Atlantic, Latin America, West Africa, the Caribbean, North America, and of course, Britain and Europe. And there was a period between about 1650 and 1730 where organized piracy was active all throughout these regions in a way it had never been before in history, pretty much. We've had pirates all throughout history. For the most part, though, in many eras of history, a lot of pirates usually were fighting for a government or fighting against a specific government, or they were being hired or they were conducted by very powerful, connected people. But this period I'm talking about right now, this golden age of piracy, was a period where we saw kind of these organized bands of pirates not fighting for a government, not trying to work for someone in charge, or not even being run by a very significant person in charge in general, like a king or a clan leader. I'm talking, these are pirates that operated for themselves within the Atlantic world, kind of robbing indiscriminately and terrorizing the Atlantic world for their own personal gain. And this is kind of really the only time period in history where we've really seen this. So there are kind of 3 phases of what we call the golden age of piracy. So the first starts really kind of in the mid 1600s, like 1650s, 60s, 70s. And this is when French pirates, for the most part, were really kind of dominating a lot of areas of the Atlantic, and they were specifically going after a lot of Spanish ships. During the 1600s, the Caribbean was a huge push-pull of competition between the Spanish, the English, and the French, but especially the English and Spanish. The Spanish in the 1600s kind of had the huge foothold. They were kind of the most significant power because of their colonization in Central America and modern-day Mexico. And of course, we have the British coming in, trying to get a lot of plantation islands, and France would eventually get some islands kind of in the leeward regions. But they were also finding that a lot of French sailors were also finding their own little havens there, such as the island of Tortuga, for example. Now, these pirates were known as buccaneers, which comes from the French word boucanier, and that really has to do with roasting meat. And they got this name because a lot of these pirates were actually land-based in many ways and were known for smoking meat. We're very creative with how we come up with titles for people. But they targeted Spanish ships in particular because Spain had been targeting a lot of French ships and had actually kind of taken over a lot of islands where French sailors hung out, such as Tortuga. And so this is kind of what we call the buccaneering period. But this is also the time where we do see a lot of very significant English pirates, most famously Henry Morgan, who was most famous for destroying the city of Panama with his sailors. It's debatable as to whether or not he was a pirate because he was kind of working for the English government at the time, and we'll talk about this difference. But he would become governor of Jamaica as a result of basically sacking all of Panama. Now, then we move a little bit ahead into the 1690s, and this is actually a period of piracy that does not take place in the Atlantic world, but is still included because we're looking at British pirates. And this is where we're seeing English pirates who are operating in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, and many of them are actually privateers. And privateers are basically pirates for hire. They're like mercenaries. They work for a government with a contract, and they basically are contracted to attack specific ships in specific regions during a specific period of time, usually during war. But in this case, in the Indian Ocean, we have British privateers to try to defend their East India Company ships as the British East India Company is gaining a powerful foothold into places like India. And this is where we have people like Henry Avery and Captain William Kidd. And both of these were pirates who terrorized Indian Mughal ships, which were like the elite ruling class. Henry Avery was known for stealing the Ganges Sawai, which was one of the wealthiest of the Mughal ships, and also known for terrorizing the people on that ship, pillaging, raping, all the really horrible things that you hear about pirates. But then he disappears in history. We don't know what happened to him. There's a lot of legends. Some say he married a queen, a Mughal queen, and ran off. Some say that maybe he ended up back in England but penniless. Some say he maybe retired in the Americas, but we don't know. But a lot of his crew was captured and put on trial and then eventually executed. And then we have, of course, William Kidd, who was a privateer, but then ended up robbing ships pretty indiscriminately. Although saying that he was not violating terms of his contracts because he said he was only going after French ships because he was allowed to attack French ships. But some of these ships were actually captained by Englishmen or others, and so thus violating his contract. And he becomes kind of a pirate where there's a huge manhunt going after him because the Indian merchants basically told Britain, if pirates ever come back, we'll cut off all trade, and this would bankrupt Britain if that happened. So they do a huge manhunt for Captain Kidd, and ultimately he is betrayed when he hits the Americas. He is lured to Boston by a friend of his, and he is then turned over to the authorities, shipped back to England, and executed in May of 1701. Then piracy goes on pause because of the outbreak of the War of Spanish Succession, and many, many pirates ended up becoming privateers. They would take a pardon, have their crimes forgiven if they agreed to work for the government during the war. But when the war ends, many of these pirates would actually go back to being pirates on their own. Or I'm sorry, many of the privateers would go back to being pirates. And these are the pirates we're often thinking about. These are like the Pirates of the Caribbean pirates. You have Benjamin Hornigold, you have Samuel Bellamy, you've got people like Blackbeard, Stede Bonnet, and you see female pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, Jack Rackham, Charles Vane. These are when the really, really infamous pirates come from. So it's 3 rounds kind of going into the 1720s. And by the end of the 1720s, piracy really has died down to the point where the organized bands have kind of disappeared. The major leaders have been executed or died at this point. The Royal Navy has become a lot stronger. It was just no longer lucrative to be a pirate, and so many of them would end up taking pardons and becoming privateers. Now, who were these pirates? Who were the people who actually wanted to become these pirates? So if you're looking at kind of an average pirate ship, let's just say an average group of pirates, about 50% are going to be English or colonial American or British American. The other 50% will be Scottish, Irish, African, and European. And the vast majority of these pirates were men, young men, 20s and 30s. Captains were often a bit older due to their experience, but for the most part, pirates were actually pretty young. And they weren't pirates for very long. The average lifespan of a pirate, once they were a pirate, was about 2 years. And if they were lucky, they could get wealthy enough to retire. But most of them would either die in battle, die of illness or injury at sea, or they would be captured and then executed for their crimes. And what's quite interesting is that many of these pirates weren't actually nearly as violent as we think. For the most part, pirates wanted to get wealthy quick, and so they might try it for just a year or two. Pirates also, when they would attack ships, they wanted to get in and out as fast as they could. So they actually weren't quite as deadly as we think. And so when we look at Stede Bonnet, who I'll talk about in the latter half of this presentation, he's actually quite the outlier here. So, like I said a few minutes ago, many pirates had been privateers during wars, and then the contract would end and they would go back to pirating. It's a lot of good money to be a privateer. You rob ships and you can keep about 80% of your loot, and 20% goes back to the government. And so, as a pirate, people wanted to keep, work for themselves and kind of keep this sort of compensation. And so that's why they would go back to it. Most people would become pirates because of lack of opportunities for them. It was a hard life working for merchants or being in the Navy, harsh punishments, low pay, not even a guarantee of pay. Pirate ships, everything was voted on. You were guaranteed an equal share. And a lot of this was due to survival. You had to be very organized. Pirate ships were actually very organized for survival purposes. And a lot of other people who would volunteer to be pirates, but many, many pirates were also kidnapped into it. So they would claim later when they were captured. So we can see very, very many reasons why people might become a pirate. Oops. Okay. Now, what does this have to do with the Carolinas? So the Carolinas has kind of its own large pirate history, and of course it has a lot of its own connections to Scotland. As we know, we've read the books, we've watched the show. We know that there's a very large Scottish Highlander population and Scotch-Irish population. And the big thing about the Carolinas, what we have to understand about colonial America in general, is that these colonies kind of lived pretty much on their own, meaning that while yes, England was the colonial power, the colonies ran themselves. They had their own legal systems, they had their own courts, they had their own governors, and people made the decisions for their own colony. And this included the Carolinas, North and then what would become South Carolina. They were very strong economically, particularly in the South. The Carolinas had a huge connection to the Caribbean, and the Caribbean was known, of course, for producing sugar. And sugar was really the most prized item to come out of the Caribbean, through horrific measures. But it was kind of the number one traded item. And the South, being in closer proximity to the Caribbean, did a lot of trade with Caribbean ships. And so this made the Carolina colonies probably some of the wealthiest colonies in British North America. And Charlestown, South Carolina, later Charleston, was the wealthiest of pretty much every single city within colonial America by the turn of the 18th century because of their trade. They traded items like tobacco, and tobacco was very highly desired across the sea in Europe, and then, of course, within the Caribbean. So we see that there is a lot of economic prosperity, and we see that they also are able to rule themselves. And this is very important in terms of the Carolina connection to piracy. Okay. Now, as we know, Scotland and piracy has a huge connection to the Carolinas. I'll go through this really briefly. I'm sure this has probably been talked about in other presentations that you may have seen. But, there's a big question, at least I know it was a question for me. Why was Scotland, or why were Scottish people so attracted to the Carolinas? What brought them there? And a lot of the reason was because was the royal governor of North Carolina, Gabriel Johnson, who was actually Scottish, and he encouraged a lot of Scottish Highlanders to come to the Carolinas by offering them 10-year tax exemptions if they came over as the colony was growing. And so part of the reason why a lot of Highlanders came was because after the Battle of Culloden and then the subsequent Highland clearances, were basically people were kicked off their land, forced to work for the British, put in prison. A lot of the Highlanders and also many other Scottish people were pushed out of Scotland and found a place to go in the Carolinas. Many of them were also sent there as indentured servants. You know, we saw this a bit in Outlander, and we read about this quite a bit in Outlander. They were sent as indentured servants to work in plantation fields for 7 years, and then they could get their freedom. And the particular cities that attracted a lot of the Scottish people were the city of Wilmington, the port city, which was where the merchants went. And yes, there were a lot of pirates that would come in and out of Wilmington. And then going to other areas that are very familiar to us from the books, Cross Creek and Cape Fear. And this is where many farmers and also other homesteaders would go as well. So this is how we started to see like a very large Scottish population come into the Carolinas, but also kind of showing just the type of people it was attracting: merchants, maritime workers, and of course, farmers and agriculturalists who would develop a lot of the plantation culture later on in Southern history. Okay. Now, what's the connection to piracy and the Carolinas? So in order to understand the connection between the Carolinas and piracy, we have to go back in time yet again to 1651 specifically. So we have the Navigation Acts that were passed in 1651, and these were British trading restrictions meant to outdo all of their competitors in the Caribbean, especially the Spanish. Britain and Spain were fighting over many plantation islands, particularly Jamaica, because it was a great plantation island in terms of its climate, the land, and also its proximity to the Americas. And also, because the Spanish had become quite wealthy there, the British wanted it for themselves. And so what they did is they passed what were called the Navigation Acts, and it banned all British colonists from trading with anyone outside of Britain or British colonies, which meant they could no longer trade with Spanish or French or Portuguese or any other ships. Now, this did help Britain. They were able to get Jamaica from the Spanish during the Anglo-Spanish War in the Caribbean. But what it did is it upset the colonies. The colonists didn't like losing these trading restrictions, especially the Carolinas, which again, remember, had huge connections to the Caribbean, which meant they were trading frequently with French and Spanish merchants. And so now suddenly they're not able to technically get goods such as wine and certain types of sugar, textiles, spices, other items that they might want. And so many of them began turning towards pirates. See, pirates would go ahead and they would rob ships indiscriminately. And then what they would do is they would bring the goods into the colonies where they knew they could sell them for a good price. In fact, people worked with pirates so well that there were governors that either turned a blind eye or sometimes would work with them directly. For example, in North Carolina, they almost welcomed pirates in a lot of ways going into the 18th century. And what these laws also did is these laws made it so that way there was a lot of tension between Britain and the colonies. Britain begins to crack down on piracy, and therefore begins cracking down on the colonies. It cracks down on the colonies and says, you have to abide and use our laws. You cannot use your own laws anymore in order to try pirates. And so this starts to create a lot of anger between British people or British colonialists, other colonists, and Britain as well. But pirates would still end up helping the Carolinas. In fact, showing the map of the Outer Banks here off the coast of North Carolina, it is estimated that there were about 2,000 pirates that lived or sailed throughout the Outer Banks during the Golden Age of piracy. And the reason for this is because, one, the proximity to the shore, they're able to go into the port cities and they're able to trade. It's also alongside a lot of trading lanes, so they can rob a lot of ships, but also you can see there's a lot of really narrow corridors kind of going in and around, lots of these little shoals to sail through, and pirate ships were generally smaller and faster, and they could hide in these inlets and they could sail in and out much quicker and better than many other merchant ships or British naval ships. So the Outer Banks were really, really highly desirable for pirates to hang out in. Now let's take a look at a couple of really infamous North Carolina pirates. I'm sure, there's a lot of you here from North Carolina. You're probably like, yes, here we go. The people who are famous here. So the most famous is Edward Teach, also known as Blackbeard. And just some background. He was an English pirate. He was from Bristol and he operated as a pirate captain from about 1716 until November 22nd, 1718. And he was known for terrorizing North America. He went after a lot of British ships in particular, sailing up and down the Atlantic seaboard. What's interesting about him is even though he did capture a lot of ships and did rob people a lot, he actually wasn't that violent, which a lot of people are surprised. In fact, he never killed anyone during his whole career except the very final battle where he died. And so what he did is he used these intimidation tactics in order to get people to surrender. Remember, we want to get in and get out real fast to minimize any damage and to make sure we can get all the goods that we want and sail away quick. So if you take a look here at this image, this is from a general history of the pirates published in 1724, which is a collection of pirate biographies, pretty fictionalized, but still very interesting. And you can see Blackbeard is pictured here having a long black beard, and he's pictured kind of having these tendrils of hair with smoke coming out. He had a really long black beard to go against society at the time. The idea was polite society, look like a gentleman, make sure that you're clean shaven. So he goes against this. And he was known for lighting fuses of gunpowder in his beard. So smoke would rise up and make it look like he was coming out of hell. And he would brandish his sword, yelling and swearing, basically terrifying people into surrendering really quick. Now, as a result, he became really famous. He became so infamous that in order to kind of save himself for a while, he ends up taking a pardon, meaning he kind of confesses his crimes. And he lives in Bath, North Carolina for about 6 months, 6 to 9 months. It's here. He supposedly he gets married. He's a member of the community, pretty, in a lot of ways, well respected. But then he decides to go back to piracy. Now, what's interesting is the North Carolina governor would not do anything to try to stop Blackbeard. He didn't mind. Blackbeard brought in a lot of goods. It was actually the Virginia governor who went after Blackbeard. They're like, look, we share a border. North Carolina's not doing anything. Is robbing us. So the Virginia government sends the Coast Guard led by Lieutenant Maynard, and they engage in a battle. The Coast Guard engages in a battle against Blackbeard on November 22nd, 1718, off of Ocracoke. And it's in this battle that Blackbeard is going to be beheaded and thus will end his career. And supposedly his head was paraded on a bowsprit up and down the Atlantic seaboard, and his skull was encased in silver and became used as a drinking vessel, so the legend says. Now, the other pirate, really infamous and also very familiar here, is Stede Bonnet. And he was an English Barbadian pirate. So he was English, but he was born and raised in Barbados, and he was a plantation owner. And in 1717, he had a bit of a midlife crisis, abandoned his plantation, abandoned his family, and decided one day, I will become a pirate. He literally just declared himself a pirate. He was very wealthy. He bought a ship, hired a crew, went sailing to go rob ships. And so he wasn't really very well respected. No well-respecting pirate will buy a ship and hire a crew. What's interesting, though, is he paid his crew a salary. Usually pirates were just paid in what they could steal. But he was known for pirating up and down the Atlantic seaboard, with a particular interest in the North Carolina seaboard because of all the trading that happens there. I see our flag means death in the comments. Yes, that's a pretty fun show to watch about Stede Bonnet here. And also Blackbeard, because Stede Bonnet and Blackbeard do team up for a brief period of time. Stede Bonnet has a lot of money. He's got a huge ship called the Revenge. They're sailing together when Blackbeard gets his ship that he renames the Queen Anne's Revenge. It was originally a slaving ship called La Concorde. And they team up together in 1718, but Stede Bonnet is pretty incompetent. A lot of the pirates who work for him don't like him very much. He'd also been injured in battle, and so he wasn't doing well as a pirate. And so ultimately, Blackbeard, when he takes his pardon, as I said a few minutes ago, the way he's able to get the pardon was by betraying Stede Bonnet and his crew. And so Stede Bonnet gets arrested. He escapes, but then gets rearrested in South Carolina. And he tries to see if he could get pardon, saying, I'm really wealthy, like, I'm a gentleman. And if anything, the governor was like, no, then you really should have known better. And so he gets executed on December 10th, 1718 in Charleston, South Carolina. So two of your very, very famous pieces of history here. Okay. So this has been kind of our, I went on a bit long-winded here, but this was basically our understanding of what piracy was during this really active period. Now, Outlander, going into this portion of the storyline, goes into the 1770s, as we know, goes into the American Revolution. What was piracy like 50 years after the end of the golden age of piracy? Well, there were still pirates. There were still pirates, but mostly they were individuals or small groups. They were mostly more of a nuisance rather than a massive threat like they'd once been. They didn't really cause a lot of danger, mostly a lot of robberies. Most of them were actually privateers in some sense. A lot of them worked for local governments, robbing certain areas. And then many of them would fight as privateers during the American Revolution, actually. A lot of the American Revolution takes place on the sea, more so than we realize. So by the 1770s, piracy, as we think of it, has actually descended kind of into legend quite a bit. We have the book, A General History of the Pirates, which became a bestseller in 1724. You can still probably buy a copy at your local bookstore. You can buy it on Amazon. It's never gone out of print. And so people knew who pirates were. There were already lots of really there were a lot of really, famous pirates in history in the Carolinas. So they were already very legendary. But the idea of like real pirates, yes, people were afraid of the idea of pirates, but they weren't quite as much of a threat. Which is what makes the maritime world so fascinating in Outlander. So the maritime world does play a pretty good role, particularly in Voyager. In Voyager, this is when Jamie and Claire, after their amazing grand reunion, as you can tell, I'm a huge fan of Outlander, which is why I'm here. They are sailing across the Atlantic to get to the Caribbean because Jamie's nephew, Ian, has been kidnapped on a ship called La Bruja and is sailing across the ocean. And so they follow on the Artemis. And while on this ship, what I really loved seeing as a maritime historian was just kind of the really harsh realities at sea. Claire, being a doctor, she's treating a lot of injuries and illnesses. She's treating things like scurvy, which is a vitamin C deficiency that was very prevalent on ships. She was treating a lot of injuries which happened, broken bones, infected wounds, and of course, illnesses, various illnesses that exist on ships. These are usually intestinal, such as not cholera, but maybe dysentery. It was known as the bloody flux, and that often was quite an epidemic locally in ships. So she's treating a lot of that. And we also do see kind of maritime death practices where people will ceremoniously be shrouded and then dropped into the sea as kind of a funeral procession. And we also do see some examples of maritime superstitions. Particularly, we do see some examples of women being bad luck on ships. Some people thinking that Claire could be bad luck. Some people throughout the books, if you remember, think she might be a witch because of her skills. Women weren't actually really seen as bad luck for the most part. There's a lot of legends of female figures, such as sirens and mermaids, who, according to legends, would lure pirates into the seas. But really, it was felt that women just didn't have much of a place in the maritime world, which is quite odd because a lot of women worked on ships, oftentimes as nurses, cooks, managing food, repairs, and oftentimes as passengers as well. Okay. But let's get to the part we've been waiting for. Stede Bonnet, our resident pirate here at Outlander, our resident villain for a period of 3 books here. Now, what's interesting is that I believe Diana Gabaldon, she herself believed that, or said that Stede Bonnet could be the grandson of Stede Bonnet, who we just talked about. Now, the big question here is, Stede Bonnet, is he actually a pirate? He is put on trial for robbery, crimes of piracy, other maritime issues, but he actually escapes his hangings in the very beginning of the book Drums of Autumn. Jamie Fraser helps him escape, and he and Claire help him out later. Of course, this doesn't stop Stephen Bonnet from, trying to be a villain to them. He ends up robbing them, robs them of their money, steals Claire's wedding rings. And so some people could argue that maybe he was what we call a river pirate, someone who is going to be robbing at sea. Now, the definition of a pirate was someone who would rob and murder at sea or on any body of water, but this definition kind of becomes a bit convoluted over time. And so during the late 1700s, going into the 1800s, we do see river pirates. So people who aren't really on the ocean anymore robbing, but they're hanging out along rivers, which have become huge waterways for transportation as water transportation increased. So one could argue he might have been a river pirate. But really, in my opinion, Stephen Bonnet was more of a smuggler. He also worked as a merchant, as we saw in Drums of Autumn, where he captained the Gloriana, which had both passengers and also goods as a merchant captain. Now, he is shown to be a very particularly cruel captain. Harsh punishments, and in particular, really infamously, there is a girl who is sick, possibly with smallpox, and he has her thrown overboard because of a coin toss between him and Roger Wakefield. Now, I did receive some questions before this presentation, and I know that one of the questions was it common for someone who was sick to be thrown overboard? It actually wasn't. Oftentimes when people were sick, even with something like smallpox, they would be quarantined. It was very rare in general for someone to be punished by being thrown overboard. And so, in my opinion, it's very significant that Stephen Bonnet isn't just throwing a sick person overboard, he's throwing a sick child overboard, because this just wasn't really done. What we have to understand about sailors is like their number one fear is drowning. And so a lot of times they wouldn't even really inflict drowning as a punishment onto people, such as making them walk the plank or throwing people overboard. So this just really shows Stephen Bonnet's cruelty and kind of masochistic behavior. And this, in a way, could emulate some of the most frightening pirates, people like Charles Vane, who was known to brutally attack and be very cruel to his victims. People like Ned Lowe, who, if any of you have seen the show Black Sails, appears in the second season. Ned Lowe was known to enjoy torturing his victims. And so I think that you could probably argue maybe there's some inspiration from these actual real violent pirates kind of put into this character of Stephen Bonnet, who again becomes a huge antagonistic figure for several books. And now, of course, one of the big things we know about Stephen Bonnet was his brutal treatment of Brianna, particularly with the sexual assault that we see in Drums of Autumn and in season 4 of Outlander. Now, it was known that some pirates were very violent towards women. Pirates, when they would go on land, as we saw with Stephen Bonnet in Drums of Autumn, was that they would go and hang out in taverns. They would often spend a lot of their they would spend a lot of their money on drinking, as we saw with Stephen Bonnet, and also paying for women, prostitution. In the book and in the show, we see Brianna spots her mother's wedding rings in his possession and tries to get them back, and Stephen Bonnet basically rapes her in the process as she tries to get them back. And so this is a huge, very extreme example, again, of a pirate's cruelty towards a woman here. This actually wasn't as common as we think, but again, it really shows Stephen Bonnet's sadistic behavior as kind of emulating the cruelest of pirates, of maritime people. And then, of course, if you remember, he kidnaps her in A Breath of Snow and Ashes and in one of the later seasons of Outlander, and takes her to Ocracoke, the island where Blackbeard died, or just off the coast. And he takes her there because and as we know, pirates would often try to kidnap people and go into piracy. So even though he's not trying to make her a pirate, this is still showing that this was a huge practice amongst kind of villainous sailors here to go in, kidnapping people. It wasn't very common to kidnap women into piracy or to force women on board onto pirate ships. In fact, pirates such as Blackbeard banned women on ships entirely. So again, this just kind of shows how Stephen Bonnet has been really pushed into being kind of the worst pirate we can really imagine. Like a whole bunch of these really cruel pirates in history, all their personalities kind of being combined into this particular character. But what's particularly interesting here, again, is we're seeing Stephen Bonnet's connection to piracy in a way by taking her to Ocracoke. And so anyone who watching the show who's from North Carolina knows about Blackbeard, knows all the legends. Anyone who knows about pirates in general, researches pirates in general, would have recognized that right away as probably a bit of an Easter egg for piracy. Of course, Brianna does get rescued. They always get rescued. And then Stephen Bonnet is going to be arrested. And now his arrest and execution are also pretty significant. So one of my specialties is public executions of pirates. So of course I was very curious about these scenes when we get to it. This took place in the book A Breath of Snow and Ashes. So as we saw earlier in Drums of Autumn, he manages to escape his hanging. But in Breath of Snow and Ashes, he is caught, of course, as Brianna is saved. And then he's found guilty of all sorts of crimes, including piracy and smuggling and kidnapping. And he is sentenced to death. Now, most of the time when pirates were sentenced to death, they were hanged. In London, they would often be taken to East London on the banks of the Thames in a neighborhood called Wapping and taken to execution dock. And the reason why pirates would be taken to a water source to be hanged over the river, for instance, or in coastal cities in Charleston, South Carolina, or other places like Providence, Rhode Island, and Boston, Massachusetts, was to symbolically do the scene, take them back to the scene of the crime. Stede Bonnet gets death by what's called tidal immersion. This didn't happen as often. What this punishment was is you're tied to a gibbet, and slowly in this gibbet, the tide is going to rise until you are completely submerged in it. And you are going to be held there until the tide has gone through 3 full cycles. This, in my opinion, is because of probably some of the worst punishments you could do for a pirate, because remember I said before, pirates in particular were very afraid of drowning. So most pirate lore usually has to do with dangers from drowning, such as mermaids who were said to sing hypnotic songs to seduce sailors and then drag them to the bottom of the ocean. Similar with sirens as well. Davy being dragged down into Davy Jones's locker, the watery grave below. So much of this is based on fear of drowning. And so they give Stephen Bonnet pretty much the worst punishment they could give, have him die by drowning. And it is a particularly harrowing scene to watch in the show. You can see his fear, you can see the panic, and you can see just kind of the worst torture they're giving him. And what's interesting, in both the book and in the show, Brianna actually ends up shooting him so he dies before he drowns. Was she doing this to get her own revenge, or was she actually doing this a little out of mercy? This is something that we can debate here. I thought they did it really brilliantly in the show because it's kind of left up to your own interpretation. So kind of in conclusion here, the Carolinas, as we can see, have a really huge pirate connection going back hundreds of years. I know today, in North Carolina, there are several pirate festivals and there's pirate tours. You go to South Carolina, there's pirate tours there as well. You can see plaques where Stede Bonnet was hanged. So we are very proud of a lot of our pirate history. And Diana Gabaldon, as we know, is a brilliant researcher. You watch the show, you read the books, and you can just see the hours and hours and hours of all the research and all the details that she made sure to painstakingly put into all the books. And she didn't miss any details, including with the maritime world. And I won't lie, I found that particularly impressive because a lot of times the maritime world gets very heavily exaggerated or is really inaccurate or is very much based on legend rather than reality. But Diana Gabaldon kind of showing life at sea, showing medical practices at sea and everything like that. it really shows kind of the realities here, and also showing how the definition of piracy is actually really blurred. Stephen Bonnet was probably more of a smuggler than a pirate, but he is actually referred to a pirate several times in the book and in the show. And this is probably because the word pirate over time kind of just became interchangeable. It became just kind of a word for anyone who would rob and murder if they had some sort of sea connection. And Diana Gabaldon really goes into detail about this. So, as a historian, a maritime historian, it's not just simply that I love the show and books because I just think they're awesome. I do. But as a maritime historian, particularly for these storylines, I very much think that she has put in so much detail and there's a lot to be learned about it. So, again, as a pirate historian, I find it very impressive that we've been able to have such a complicated and such a unique character as Stephen Bonnet, clearly based on a lot of infamous pirates, but also very much kind of given his own unique spin and also the complications behind what we can call a pirate and what we can't call a pirate. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for listening. And I think that was exactly 45 minutes. Yep. And thank you for listening. And I look forward to taking some questions.
You really did right at 45 minutes. You couldn't have planned that any better. So I have a question about when young Ian is taken by the Bruja. Are those pirates? Would you call them pirates, the people
So
that took him?
So again, that's kind of debatable as well. I sometimes feel like that's almost a cop-out answer, but you could argue that they were pirates because they were robbing at sea, and then they kidnapped him. But we don't know if they were exactly murderous and robbing at sea. So I wouldn't be so quick to put the title of pirate onto the Bruja because they were also going to the Caribbean specifically for other merchant reasons as well. So a pirate ship wouldn't necessarily be going that far, if legitimately so. So I don't know if I would necessarily call them pirates.
Would there have been pirate ships in Scotland in that area, or did that? Yes.
Yeah, there would. There would. Glasgow in particular actually has like quite a bit of a maritime and pirate connection. So does Edinburgh. For example, Captain Kidd was from Dundee, Scotland, and so he's got very much got that Scottish connection there. But there was known to be pirates that would sail around the coast of Scotland, oftentimes fighting against British ships because Scotland and England never exactly got along very well. So that was usually what their specific targets were.
Excellent. So you want to stop your share maybe, and then that way we're not like tiny little things in the corner. Yeah, that's better. So we got a lot of questions. I know I sent you the questions in advance, and there were quite a few questions about female pirates. Several specific questions about Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Are there other notable female pirates other than those two? And I think you wrote a book about them, didn't you?
I did, called Pirate Queens, about Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Yes, there were other pirates, female pirates throughout history that we know about. We don't know about very many other female pirates during the golden age of piracy. Again, there just wasn't a lot written about female pirates, and a lot of women just, it's funny because we think of Anne Bonny and Mary Read as being so famous and iconic female pirates. They actually weren't written about very much, believe it or not. But there were some really famous ones. For instance, Grania O'Malley, commonly known as Grace O'Malley. She was known as kind of the pirate queen of Ireland in the late 1500s. She was married to a clan leader and then terrorized British merchant ships until she had sons who were kidnapped, and she had to appeal to Queen Elizabeth to try to get them back, and then worked as a privateer for Elizabeth. In the ancient world, we had Teuta of Illyria, who commanded ships in the ancient Mediterranean, had Saida al-Hurra, who was was married to the governor of Morocco in the 1500s, targeting Spanish ships. And then really infamously, we have Zhang Yishao in China around 1810, who commanded over 1,000 pirates and dozens and dozens and dozens of ships, and allowed women to be on the ships, allowed women to be pirates on ships, and had very strict rules in terms of behavior towards women. So yes, there have been a good amount.
That's interesting. And Anne Bonny and Mary Read, did they did they come to a bad end, or did they
They
retire, or what happened
They
to them?
did. So what's interesting about Anne Bonny and Mary Read is we don't know a whole lot about their origins, especially Mary Read. There's a lot of mystery surrounding her. Anne Bonny was believed to be from Ireland, but then perhaps moved to South Carolina as a child, or maybe born in South Carolina. Again, it's a bit blurred, but generally it's accepted that she was from Ireland. And the two of them, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, would actually end up sailing with the pirate captain Jack Rackham. Anne Bonny actually would marry him at sea. But what's interesting is these two women only sailed for 2 months between August and October of
Hmm.
1720. Until they were captured. And they were put on trial in November of 1720 in Jamaica. And they were found guilty and sentenced to hang, but they got what was called a stay of execution because it turned out they were both pregnant.
Ah.
So, Anne Bonny, we don't know what happened to her. There was no record of her being hanged. There are several suggestions as to what could have happened to her. There has been a death record from St. Catherine's Parish in Jamaica showing that a woman named Anne Bonny passed away in 1731, but there were about three or four other Anne Bonnies throughout the 1700s who also had death records in Jamaica, so we can't say if it was her or not. Some people believe that she may have gone back home and lived until she was in her 80s, but again, we're not sure. Mary Read, we do have records of. She died in prison of what was called jail fever.
Mm. And you said they only sailed for 2 months before they got caught?
Only two
That's
months, yeah.
fascinating.
And they
Yeah.
weren't even that successful. They
Yeah, I
caught
was
a
gonna say they
few
weren't very good
fishing
at it, and then
ships,
they got
merchant
caught.
ships, but they were ruthless, absolutely ruthless as
Mm.
pirates. Fought in men's clothing, used weapons, swore more supposedly than any other sailor. What's interesting though is that when they weren't fighting, they dressed in their normal women's clothing.
Oh, that's
So
interesting.
really just for battle.
So we've had several questions, and I've seen Erin wrote it down on our question list, and she bolded it to make sure it got asked. What made you choose this subject? Why pirates? Like, what attracted you to studying pirates?
So I've always loved both British history and colonial American history. And when I was doing my master's degree, I focused on what was called Atlantic history, which combined it. And we read a book called Villains of All Nations by Marcus Rediker, which was about Atlantic pirates during the golden age of piracy. And at that point, I didn't know much about pirates, just like Pirates of the Caribbean. You know, I love the movie, but I've always loved historical film. I've always loved, looking at popular history, and so I was very curious. You know, how did we get from these real pirates to Jack Sparrow? So that's how I kind of got into pirates, is I wanted to kind of answer the question, you know, how did we become so fascinated with pirates? And then for my PhD, I kind of narrowed it looking into the way people learned about pirates was usually by reading about their trials and going to their public executions.
Mm,
And so that's what I researched were persecutions against pirates and public executions of pirates.
that's fascinating. And you studied, I believe, in the UK, in
I
London,
did.
right? So you
I
had
did.
access
I
to
got
primary documents and everything relating to this. That's exciting.
Yep, I did my PhD at King's College London. I finished in 2017, and I did probably about 90% of my research in England. I did go to Jamaica for a few weeks at one point to do some research. Did a little bit in the States, but most of my research was available in the UK because they kept very good records. Not very records,
Yeah.
there aren't very many records from pirates themselves, but lots of records about pirates.
So have you been to North Carolina, to any of the areas that are famous for pirates?
The only place I've been to in North Carolina, honestly, is Chapel Hill because I was at a conference at the university there years ago. I'd like to explore more of North Carolina. I'd love to see more of those pirate connections. I mean, I know it's a different state, but I've been to Charleston, South Carolina, and I've learned about some of the pirate connections there. But no, I'd love to actually explore and see more of North Carolina and see some of these famous pirate locations.
I really would like to get to Beaufort, to the museum for the Queen Anne's Revenge, someday. It's just fascinating to me that they found it, and
Yes, that's been like what, a 20-year archaeological dig, from what
it's
I
huge.
understand.
And I think they're doing it at Eastern Carolina University, if I'm not mistaken.
Got
Which,
it.
of course, their mascot is the pirates.
Of
So
course.
it's very much woven into the history of Eastern North Carolina.
Mhm.
Let's see. Somebody has asked, oh, I'm betting this is from our presenter. We had Charles Brett, who talked about medical stuff so wonderfully. Were there any pirates that were physicians or surgeons?
Ooh, good question. You know, don't know. I know that like a lot of ships, they were hoping to be able to get a surgeon um, or a medical person on their ship. Usually that was kind of a very specific skill that someone would have on a ship. In terms of pirate captains, most people at sea would know like kind of your basic practices of trying to like heal a wound or
Mhm.
certain things for illnesses, but again, not a lot of knowledge. Um, I unfortunately don't know the names of specific pirates who would have had that specific job, but something for me to look into now.
That's interesting, though, to think
Mhm.
that, yeah.
Yeah.
Stede Bonnet was a gentleman, right? He was a planter. Was he a
hmm
planter? Is that right?
He was a plantation owner, a very, very wealthy one.
So
Very wealthy.
educated, I'm
Yes.
imagining. Yes.
He was educated, he was married, wife and children. And so it's really interesting that he decided to just up and leave this life and
Yeah.
go into piracy. And he had no maritime experience, no sailing experience.
So like a
He
midlife crisis.
It kind of was, and he
Yeah.
wasn't a good pirate. He wasn't a good sailor. He got injured. A lot of his crew didn't really respect him very much. A lot of them left his ship to go to Blackbeard's ship when he and Blackbeard teamed up together. So really, really interesting history there. He was not a pirate for long, but it's really fascinating.
I'm imagining that there weren't a lot of gentlemen pirates and such being educated, and that might just be, you know, prejudice on my part, thinking that, oh, they're all just a bunch of rogues who don't have any
Well,
education. But
actually, pirates. There were more educated pirates than we think, actually, particularly captains. Blackbeard was likely educated because he worked as a merchant and a privateer, and he was
oh,
apprenticed in the maritime world from when he was a child. And I do believe in the work they've done on the Queen Anne's Revenge. They've even found some handwritten documents that they believe may have been attributed to Blackbeard. I remember reading that a few years ago. But there actually were pirates were a bit more literate than we thought, particularly those of higher rank. They would have to be to keep track of ship logs, to keep track of inventory. Pirates often worked with quartermasters on the ships they attacked to check inventory logs in order to get the goods that they wanted. So it's actually a bit more literate than we think.
oh, that's interesting. So this is an interesting question. What are your thoughts on pirate flags? Most of them were fictionalized through media over the centuries. Do we have any solid information on how pirate flags were formed, or for sure what any of them actually looked like?
Yeah, there were a lot of pirate flags, and a lot of the ones in pirate media, or like that we've seen in media, are actually based on reality. So initially, kind of in the 1600s, there would be like two types of flags. There would be a red flag and a black flag. If
Mhm.
someone sailed the red flag, it would mean no quarter, meaning like we will fight to the death, we will not take prisoners. If they flew a black flag, it meant we are willing to negotiate, we will give
Mhm.
quarter if you surrender. And then, kind of over time, going into the turn of the 18th century, the red flag kind of went out of fashion there. And we did have pirates who actually would create flags, oftentimes maybe of self portraits, such, for example, oh gosh. I think it was Bartholomew Roberts or Blackbeard, I forget, but did a portrait of themselves on their pirate flag. Holding a spear, holding a heart in the other hand. Jack Rackham actually did create the very famous skull pirate flag with two crossed swords. So that was really infamous. So, kind of as a way to really show himself off. But the skull and crossbones has often been used as a symbol kind of throughout history of death in general. So you would see it in maritime logs and on gravestones going back to the Middle Ages, seeing
Mhm.
like little skull and crossbones. And so that's where a lot of it came from.
So I think we have time maybe for like one or two more questions. So you said that, Diana Gabaldon has done amazing, really accurate research. And so the way she has depicted the ships in the books is fairly accurate, but how about the TV show?
The TV show itself, from what I know of Scottish history and what I know about the Carolinas during the time period, I do think she has done very well. She's got there's so many characters in the books that were real. She gets, for example, like geographic locations, Claire and Jamie and everyone sailing into Wilmington in North Carolina. That's very accurate. That is where a lot of people came in through.
Mhm.
Many, many, many Scottish people settled at Cross Creek to
Mhm.
become farmers or homesteaders. We even did see a lot of Scottish people who actually did fight for the British during the American Revolution, which was pretty surprising. But usually it was just the battle of, it was actually for the most part just the Battle of Alamance. I think that's how you pronounce it.
Yep.
So that's another piece of really historically accurate information that she did. Medical practices of the time, that Claire talks about, all of that, as far as I know, is quite accurate. I'm not a medical historian. I know someone in the audience is, but from what I
We
know,
we do have one
yeah.
in the audience
So
tonight.
I think that from what she's done, based on what I know, I do think she's done a really brilliant job.
So the gentleman who did speak about Charles Brett, who spoke about medical practices, he says for those interested about medical practices on board ships during this time, John Moyle's book on Sea Surgeon, fourth edition, is a good resource. Okay, so let's see what else. I think we're right at 8 o'clock. I'm going to look through Erin's list and see if there's any others that kind of jump out.
Heidi, I also gave a lot of kudos if you wanted to if you wanted to look at those and
Oh
tell
yeah.
Rebecca some of them. Because
Yeah,
they're lovely.
that's a great idea. Thank you, Erin. Thank you for gathering them. This is fascinating. Thank you. I learned a metric ton. Thank you for putting this together. Pirates make for great history telling. This was a wonderful presentation, very informative, engaging presentation. I learned more about piracy, and linking it to Outlander was even better. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh,
Pretty
you're
much.
welcome. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm
Well,
glad
thank
you
you.
all enjoyed
And
it.
like you are an amazing presenter. And I was very impressed with you were speaking right to the camera and right from the top of your head. It didn't look like you even had any notes. So you clearly know your stuff. And I want to thank everybody for coming tonight to the second to the last program in this series. Of course, the finale is an evening, a conversation with author Diana Gabaldon on Thursday, December 4th. If you haven't signed up, then go ahead and sign up. I will give you a link in the post-program email so that you can do that, as well as I put links tonight, or put links in the email of resources that were discussed tonight. So thank you again, Rebecca,
You're welcome.
for
Thank you.
thank you so much. And thank you, Erin, behind the scenes, so much for gathering all the information and working very hard as usual. And okay, well, good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.